Brazil's president says that his predecessor has the right to the presumption of innocence, and he's confident in the judiciary. This as the Supreme Court starts considering coup plot charges against Jair Bolsonaro and 33 others. This after Bolsonaro's election loss back in 2022. The charges include trying to poison Lula.
Jair Bolsonaro in the firing line over his attempt to cling to power in early 2023. Brazil's Attorney General charged the former president and 33 others on Tuesday with criminal organisation, an attempted coup and an attempted abolition of the democratic state. The charges are based on an 800-page federal police report published last year, which said Bolsonaro and his vice president Walter Braga Neto were fully aware of the attempt to overthrow the newly inaugurated president, Luiz Lula Inácio da Silva.
Allied with other individuals, including civilians and military personnel, they attempted to prevent, in a coordinated manner, the result of the 2022 presidential elections from being fulfilled.
Bolsonaro was in the United States on January 8, 2023, when his supporters stormed federal buildings in an alleged attempt to subvert the government. The charges carry a total of 28 years in prison. Bolsonaro said he was not worried about the charges and decried the conviction of almost 400 of the January 8th rioters.
Is what's happening fair? These absurd convictions. Not even drug traffickers or major corrupt officials get sentences like this.
It's the latest setback for Bolsonaro, who was narrowly defeated by Lula in the presidential election in October 2022. He has already been barred from holding public office until 2030 for casting doubt on Brazil's voting system during his failed re-election campaign. The Supreme Court will now decide if there are sufficient grounds to proceed with the trial.
For more, let's go to London. Octavio Ferraz is Professor of Law at King's College London. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
My pleasure.
Not the first charges against Jair Bolsonaro. What happens next? Is it a sure thing the Supreme Court will hear the case?
I think that they will hear the case is a sure thing because the charges are very strong and backed by strong evidence. The question is how long it's going to take and what's going to come out of it, what the outcome of that trial will be, and whether it will be soon enough in order not to overlap with the next election.
A strong case, you say. The evidence in it is quite stark. A bid to poison Lula?
Well, that's only one of the charges and one of the evidences collected by the federal police. So he is being charged with 4 crimes: attempting to violently abolish the democratic rule of law, attempted coup d'etat, participation in a criminal organization, and also criminal damage. So the attempt of a coup d'etat involved, according to the evidence presented by the federal prosecutors, a plan to poison Lula, to kill Lula through poisoning or other methods, and also the vice president-elect and also the president of the Supreme Court. So 3 major figures in our democratic system were under threat, at least according to those plans, of being killed.
How's Brazil's democracy when it comes to trying former presidents? What's the mood like? Because it was so acrimonious, the election in 2022.
Yes, that's right. And unfortunately, the country is still pretty much divided. As you know, the results of the election in 22 were very close, only a 1% difference between supporters of Bolsonaro and those who voted in the Grand Coalition to keep him out of power. I think that support diminished considerably now that he's been out of power for a couple of years, and also all this evidence coming out. But for sure, it will be a very difficult trial with a lot of, the climate will be very charged. But
and that
think
climate will
yeah.
bleed into the presidential election campaign next year.
Exactly, and that's why many people believe the Supreme Court will try to do this as quickly as possible, and not to allow that to happen, because that would make the campaign even more charged than it already will be, because of the divisions in the country between the two camps, so to speak. So it will be a very challenging trial, but a necessary one, because it's very grave. Like, all the charges are very serious.
Octavio Ferraz, we're discovering here in Europe that there's kind of an international of far-right leaders, what with Vice President J.D. Vance weighing in on behalf of the leader of the German far-right ahead of their elections this coming Sunday. Donald Trump's Truth Social suing Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes in Brazil for shutting down the accounts of an exiled Brazilian right-wing commentator this Wednesday. Will Brazil begin to feel the wrath of Donald Trump over this?
Very good point. So this will add even more tension to the climate in Brazil. If it wasn't sufficient to have the divisions we have right now internally, now with the election of Trump and all the measures he's being taken, not only in Brazil, but as you mentioned correctly, elsewhere, this is going to be even more challenging. I'm not sure yet how this particular legal action in the US might influence things in Brazil, because it will take time, it will be slow, and I think that the most all eyes will be in the trial of Bolsonaro in the Supreme Federal Tribunal. But surely it doesn't help to have an added extra source of tension coming from the U.S.
Donald Trump's surrounded by those tech titans who are free speech absolutists. The case that they're bringing against Alexandre de Moraes, does that mean they'll graduate it up to, ramp it up to tariffs on Brazil?
Again, like, it's hard to predict what might come out of that. As you might recall, Alexandre de Moraes suspended X, the former Twitter, and everyone thought there would be a commotion. And in the end, most of the Brazilian population was in favor of those measures, because they understood that fake news are a very bad thing in a democracy, and you cannot say everything you want. You mentioned correctly, free speech absolutists, as if free speech could ever be absolute in a democracy. There are limits to what you should and can say. So, but the climates are changing, right? The U.S. elections are still very fresh. We don't know how they will influence things, but at least from previous experience, I think the Brazilian public seems to be aware that there are limits to what free speech can say, and hopefully that will bode well for the developments in Brazil in the near future.
Octavio Ferraz, many thanks for joining us from London.
Thank you so much.